Hello students, welcome to our course on visual semiotics for visual communication. In our last few lectures, we looked into some of the attributes of the images, or we looked into some of the attributes of your visual field. Whatever we are looking at, we were trying to analyze how we make sense out of it, how we make meaning out of it, of what we are seeing. At the end of the day, whatever you are seeing is a static visual field in front of you. There could be dynamics associated with it, but at a moment as if you are looking at an image, and then there is a series of image that you traverse over in course of time in your lives, and by that we are processing that information, and with that some amount of visual message is coming to us, some amount of interaction is happening between different communicators. Maybe there is a communicator, there is a receiver if it is a man-made environment, otherwise if it is natural, then also nature stands there and you receive that information, and based on this communication we are taking some decisions, we are making some meaning, we are making some judgment out of it, and that is all about visual semiotics. That is why we are terming it as semiotics. Semiotics is a subject where you learn about different signs and how these signs interact with each other, how do we comprehend these signs and make meaning, and because we are making some meaning out of it, there is whole lot of domain that arises out of it, which is how we understand this meaning, what is the effect that this meaning is happening, whether it is efficient or not. So, we talked about the efficiency, we talked about the effectiveness, and we talked about the engaging nature. When in our introductory session, we talked about these three principles of any visual that we create, and now we are going to looking at how do we make it efficient, how do we make it engaging, and things like that. For that we looked into the Gestalt principles, we looked into the metaphors, we looked into the connotation and denotation aspects, and so on. Today what we are going to look at as a continuation to that, in all these things we have been talking about some kind of an image. So, today we are going to have a deeper look at what an image is and what are the qualities of an image. So, if there is an image, there are certain attributes about an image, about a picture, about an art, and today we will also talk about a little bit of art and the expression of art, because this has an implication on how we look at things. This we will discuss elaborately in our next lecture when we talk about visual culture and visual narratives, where we look at how we look at art and that shapes our vision towards looking at things. But in today's class we will concentrate more on the image. So, I will show you one image today first, which will give you an understanding. So, if we look at an image over here, this is a very famous painting which is present in Museum of Modern Art by Claude Monet, and what Monet tried to depict, why I am showing this image over here, have a look at how this image has been done. It is some amount of colors, some swatches, but what he depicted over here is the reflection of clouds over a water lily. So, you are not seeing a real pond with a reflection of clouds and the water lilies, but what you are looking at is an image of that through a person. That is what we are doing in visual communication, isn't it? There is certain amount of thought process, there is certain amount of information which is there, which I as a designer or I as an artist represent it. So, there is a real object, that is what is the landscape of semiotics. So, we have a real object which was there, I, or in this case you as an interpretant have some knowledge about this object. This has been represented by some kind of image in this particular case you saw this painting. So, this has been represented by an image that has an expression, and the expression if we look at here is this. This could have been depicted in a different way. There could be different ways of representing that and expressing that. So, in this particular case Monet has represented that in a particular fashion, and then this expression reaches to you and you now are making some meaning out of it. At first go, perhaps you might not be able to decipher what this thing, and this particular painting I have seen it, you have to watch it from a distance. If you go closer to the painting, all that you will get is some swatches of color. You might not be able to understand what this thing is all about or what it is representing, but all you can understand is its expression. So, you have to take a distance, have a look at it, and then based on your knowledge you make some meaning out of it. So, the idea is we are encountering with this kind of images all the time, and based on that we are taking some decision. So, let us get into a little deeper what exactly is happening in these images. So, basically images involve two types of participant. One is a represented participant and another is the interactive participant. So, what it essentially means is that we have participants in an image. So, an image is not a lonely place. So, an image has participants, and the first participant is the represented participant. So, you have the represented participants in the image, and they could be people or things or places and many other things. So, what it essentially means is that when you are encountering with an image, when you are encountering with an artwork, a visual for that matter, you have some amount of representation which has happened on that image, and these are called the represented participant, or in other words the people, the things, the places that are being represented over here are the represented participants. Why are they participants? We will see, because there is certain amount of interaction which is happening between the communicator and the receiver. We talked about human cooperative communication and its model. We had a communicator and the receiver, and there is certain amount of interaction which is taking place between the two. So, here that communication is taking place by some kind of a participant, and these participants are mute in this particular case. They are in the image, but they are still participating in some kind of communication. And the other kind of participant is the interactive participant. So, these represented participant is static, they are not interactive in a sense that they are not acting as such, but then we have the interactive participant who are active in nature. And who are these participants? They are nothing but the producer of this image or the communicator and the viewer or the receiver. So, basically what is happening over here, we have a static represented participant who are talking for something else, and you have some active participants, or you call them interactive participants, and they are nothing, they are no one else than the communicator, the producer of this particular image and the viewer of this particular image. So, now to put it this way, if we look at this painting again, if we look at this particular image again, here the represented participants are the place, the objects, the things that you see. They are the represented participants, they are participating with you in terms of a representation. whereas we have the producer or the communicator of this image, which is artist Monet, and we have the viewer. So, in this case you are the viewer, there was an artist who created this. So, there was a person who was trying to communicate through this represented participants, and hence the whole communication is taking place in this particular image. So, this is how the different kinds of participation is taking place when you are looking at an image. As such, it might be very simplistic to say that we look at an image and we make some judgment, but did you ever think about it that there are so many participants who are playing in this entire interaction? When we have an interaction between two persons, when we play a game, there is certain amount of interaction happening between different players. So, in this particular case, when you are looking at an image, the players are the things which are there in the image, the communicator and the viewer. So, there is constant interaction which is happening between them, and there are three different relationships which are possible based on this, and that creates the entire understanding and representation of an image. So, there are three kinds of interactions which are possible. We will look into all of the three. So, based on these participants, so there is a relation between the represented participants, there is a relation between the represented and the interactive participants, and there is a relation between the interactive participants. So, things they do for each other through images. Very, very important aspect of visual communication and visual semiotics, which we are touching upon. And based on these three interactions, all the designs, principles and everything that you learn, there are many other courses which talk about details in principles of visual communication, or digital art and things like that, digitalization of visual communication. So, whatever is happening, it is revolving around these three interactions. So, what are these three interactions? The first one is the interaction between the represented participants. So, there within the image you have represented participants and they interact with each other. So, that creates, now if you remember, if our lessons on composition, when we talked about there is balance, rhythm, harmony, accentuation, focus, colors, patterns, all these things are nothing but helping in certain amount of interaction between these objects, between these things which are there in your visual field. So, they are the represented participants for your interaction, and they have an interaction between each other. So, if you, for example, if you in your visual field, if you place a circle like this and you place another circle like this and you place another circle like this and this, so these are various represented participants whom we have got in this particular image. So, various amounts of represented participants are there, but they are having some interaction with each other, which we learnt in a great extent in Gestalt psychology. So, now you can see that certain amount of Gestalt psychology will play over here, which is nothing but based on interaction amongst these participants. So, what are the Gestalt psychology which is happening here? The law of proximity. So, this is in proximity to this, in proximity to this. So, this creates a law of common fate which are in similar direction, a law of continuity is taking place over here, a law of similarity owing to shapes taking place over here. Closure perhaps is not working in this case, but there are certain amount of laws which are acting in place based on Gestalt. But what is the basis of this? The basis of this is the interaction between the represented participants. So, from today onwards, whenever you are designing a particular visual, whenever you are trying to communicate visually, always remember that whatever is being represented in that visual, they have some interaction with each other. And these interactions could be termed by various principles, whether there are balance, whether they are foreground, background, whether there is depth, space between them, rhythm is happening. There could be many other principles acting in that case, but what essentially you are doing is interaction which is taking place between these participants. That is the first one. Now, coming to the second interaction which is happening, which is very, very obvious and which is very understandable, that there will be an interaction between what is represented over here and what the interactive participants are. So, in this particular case, you are looking at this visual, and I am the communicator in this particular case, and you are the receiver or you are the viewer of this particular visual. So, I have created this and you are receiving this particular thing, and in this particular case there is interaction which has happened with me and the represented participant. So, there was first level of interaction which happened where I decided how I will place these circles or bubbles in a visual field, and you then is receiving that and you are interacting with that particular visual in a certain manner. So, all of them had some kind of interaction over here, and based on that interaction ultimately the message got transferred from me to you, and you might have made some kind of sense out of it. So, this is what keeps on happening at another level between the interactive participants and the represented participants. Now, coming to the third one, which is very essential, is to understand the interactions between the interactive participants in themselves, what they are trying to represent through that image, which we have discussed in great details in the first week, where we have talked about the communicator and the receiver and their interactive motive, interaction motives and things like that, how they communicated. So, I will not get into details of that, but these are three levels of interactions which happen when you encounter with a visual. Now, coming to the types of images, this is one example by Alfred Leith, where this was a recruitment poster, and you can see how the images, the person represented over here is, so there is an interaction between the elements, between the objects that has been represented in this particular painting. So, there is a representation between the represented, there is an interaction between the represented objects. So, there is this person, there is this hand, there is this text which is coming over here. So, all these have an interaction with each other, and hence it is being depicted over here. So, that is the interaction between different represented things on it, and then there is a representation, there is an interaction which is happening between the communicator and between the viewer, and through this particular image or through this particular represented participants. So, all these participants are coming together, and hence you immediately get a meaning out of it, you immediately make some sense out of this poster, where you can understand that it is very urgent, it is targeting towards me, it is very forceful and affirmative, whatever it is, but that meaning is being communicated through this image in this fashion. So, now we will go to two types of image representation. So, there are two types of image representation. The first one is the representational image or representational artwork. This is the time when we look at representation aims to represent actual objects and subjects from reality. So, as the name suggests, it is kind of very easy to understand. The representational image is the image which is trying to depict reality. So, it is trying to represent something in real fashion. So, now if we look at semiotics per se, we are trying to represent an object by its signifier, but that not always necessarily be representing the original object. There could be variation, there is a range of variation which is possible, and that is the beauty of visual communication. Otherwise, it becomes a photograph, it becomes a videograph. That is one form of visual imagery or representation, where you are trying to depict a realistic thing and you are trying to represent that by a method. But mind it, the signifier, when you are trying to represent a real thing by a signifier, the expressions could be different. So, in this particular case we are talking about representational image, and representational imagery may have a degree. We will talk about that in just few moments, but they might have a degree of variance, and that brings in the sense of creativity, that brings in the sense of intuitiveness when we talk about artwork. So, now we look into another part. Representationalism represent actual subjects from reality. So, they pick up subjects from reality, although some of these forms take some of these forms take steps towards abstraction, they still fall under the category of representation. So, what it means is that we take things from object of real world, we try to represent those objects in a representational image, but we many a times make some variations, we make changes. So, it is on the discretion of the communicator, it is on the discretion of the artist or designer, and he makes some changes, but still it falls under the category of representational image, because you are still trying to represent something else, a real time object perhaps, and that brings it into the genre of representational images. So, we will see some of the examples of representational image, and now we get into the movements of art to look into some of the representational aspects. So, Impressionism, which was a 19th century art which took shape, and there if you look at this particular painting by Monet again, and he was an impressionist artist. So, the initial painting that you see and this one is by the same artist, and if you look at this particular painting, you see a play of light has played a very important role. Light brings with it the sense of reality, realism. Look at the ordinary real subjects which have been chosen, very ordinary simplistic objects are chosen, but that creates an experience, that creates a very strong sense of experience which matches with your experiences, and there is a sense of time. So, these are the essential properties of an impressionist art, but impressionism in reality is actually a representational form of art. It is not a true photograph which you saw, it is not a photograph, it is an image. It has been created by someone, by certain colors, by certain simplistic forms. There has been just some colors, some lines and forms, and that created, what did it create? It created an essence of time, it created an experience, it created the play of light and shade, all by some elements of design, that is all, bringing them together. So, what is happening? But the sense that you are getting is that of a representation of a river, there is a shape, there is a sun setting, and you get a full experience of this, you get an impression of that particular moment of time frozen, the reality, but being represented. So, you understand the beauty of visual communication, the beauty of art coming into picture over here, that is, you are trying to represent some real life thing, objects, by notion of something very, very different by a very simplistic objective form. So, represented participants are so simplistic in this particular case. So, this is one way of impressionism, and why we are talking about this is because this art movements, this kind of seeing images has influenced us over course of time, and today the image that we encounter has a precursor of this. So, if we are looking at this image today, when we encounter another image, we have a notion of this particular image in our mind, and hence we take some judgment. There is another example by the same artist. Look at again some swatches, it is a realistic representation of a particular moment, but what has been used? Just some colors, some elements of design, but that creates a representation. So, representational art could be done in various fashions. Now, we come to realism. Realism was a particular art movement which took shape from the French school of art, and here the truthfulness, if you look at this painting, the truthfulness was of utmost importance. There was no stylization, accurate depiction, and there was lot of stress on how you create this realistic senses. So, you create a sense of realism through your techniques, through different kinds of, apart from taking a photograph, how do you bring in the sense of realism, and there you play a lot of tricks to create this truthfulness, to create something which has no stylization. We will see in another form where stylization plays a major role, and it is very different from the realism. Or we were talking about here the representationalism. So, you saw two types of representation now. One is the impressionism, which is a form of representation, and you are seeing the realism, which is another form of representation, very differently treated. Now, let us come to something which is, there is a difference between realism and idealism. So, there have been attempts in visual field where you are looking at realism and you are looking at idealism. So, in realism what is happening, the choice of subject dealing with these things and human activities are commonplace in nature, whereas in case of idealism you are looking for things which are not commonplace in nature, which is something beyond commonplace, which is something idealist, which is one of its kind, something like that. So, one, realism is looking for a very common attribute, whereas idealism is looking for something which is beyond commonality, which is one of its kind, which is the perfect one you are talking about. So, another difference is the representation. In case of realism, the representation of the forms of nature in any subject chosen is by imitating those forms with utmost possible truth of nature, whereas here the artists have searched for and chose such forms as are universally regarded as most perfect of their kind. So, you understand the difference what is playing between realism. Here the representations are very commonplace, which are very, very common in practice, and you have just represented that. But in case of idealism, it gives a sense as if the representer has looked around, has gone beyond and searched something which is perfect in nature, which is beyond this, and you are showing the ideal objectivity. So, now you see representation also has a range. One is you are depicting what is available, another where you are trying to bring in a realist, an idealist perspective to it, the best one, the most authentic one. Then there comes a question between realism and stylization. So, in case of realism, there is a degree of stylization which you have. So, if you look at this particular image, this is a realistic image, and then this is a semi stylized image where you can see the hair has been changed, there has been perfect symmetry, and the way it has been done, it is a semi stylization. You are stylizing, you are moving away from reality, and this is a massive or a drastic stylized case that you see, where you really cannot make out what it is representing. So, which I was talking about, there is a degree of stylization and there is a degree of realism or impression of representation which can happen is this. So, the amount of, if you keep on increasing the stylization, the more the stylized you make, the more it gets away from the representationalism, but there is always a scope of blending realism with stylization and hence representing that. So, that is another attribute which is possible, and art represents nothing. If art that represents nothing in physical world, that is abstract. So, something which is not representing anything is abstract, and that is possible in case of art. That is a very, very interesting aspect of art, where you are talking about representation, and then you are talking about abstraction, and abstraction is something which does not represent. And how does it happen? That you are creating something, you have an image which does not represent something, is by you are trying to show the reality by a different mode. You are moving away from the real object and its representation, and you are trying to represent that by a different mode. So, what it essentially says is abstraction aims to take subjects from reality, but present them in way that is different from the way that is viewed in our reality. So, the way we are looking at objects, we are trying to represent that in a different way, and here the emphasis is many a times on lines, shapes and colors and many other elements of design which transform your real subject. So, the idea in this case is the way you represent, the way you see an object, here you are transforming that, and here you are representing that in by some different mode, and that is what brings abstraction. And how you bring abstraction is by utilization of elements of design, the lines, colors, forms, shapes and texture. So, we will continue this lecture in our next lecture, where we talk about the visual narratives and visual culture, because they are closely connected. So, we will take forward the discussion on representation and abstraction in our next lecture. Thank you.